Hey Pete, thank you so much for joining the podcast. You are the Bitcoin historian, as everybody knows you on Twitter. How's everything going?
All-time highs today. We're making history in real time. Love it.
Were you expecting this when you started studying Bitcoin in 2013, when you
Oh,
started?
it's hard to know what I expected. I don't think I expected much of anything because I didn't buy it
No.
right away.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, no. I mean, back then, people who don't know, right? My journey to being a historian started with being a journalist. So I was really just kind of an
Mm,
underemployed person out of college. Was looking for someone to let me work and do journalism. That was what my degree was in. So I was really looking for anybody who would pay me to write anything. I had a friend who was kind of into mobile payments, like he was working at an obscure journal, kind of out of Boston. And, he asked me what I thought about Bitcoin. I had no idea about it. And, this time would have been like Bitcoin was at 100, $200. First mainstream penetration. Mount Gox was the big exchange. And yeah, people were accepting Bitcoin for payments. But yeah, it was this whole crazy world, right? I like to say that I always thought finance was kind of this boring thing. I'm from the Northeast in the US, so, my background is more kind of liberal in terms of like growing up as a college kid, being like kind of anti-finance, anti-Wall Street. And so when Bitcoin came along, it was like you just, pop this big piñata in this like boring financial world. And, I remember very quickly, like a couple months in. So I started freelancing for CoinDesk, which was then like a really small site. It was like four or five people kind of just on a Skype channel somewhere. I was the first person in the US working there. So they would send me all these places, and I would go and I'd see these journalists from like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and they would have CoinDesk open, like reading about Bitcoin because they didn't know anything about it. So I was like, okay, like this is something I can get into on the ground floor. And yeah, I really feel like from there I kind of I don't know how much I got it, right? Like it took me a really long time of being exposed to Bitcoin. And even then it was like an all-time high scenario like now, right? Bitcoin was setting new time high all-time highs like every other day. And it sort of felt like I missed it, which is, hilarious because 11 years later, there's probably people watching this who are, FOMOing now. They've got to get all the sats. It's, back then it was, I was reading about Bitcoin and Wired, and they were interviewing the Silk Road founder who was anonymous. And, now we know it's Ross Ulbricht and he's about to be freed. But yeah, it was a sense that this thing was really happening, that it was going mainstream. And back then it had a very Silicon Valley, feel. The people who were getting into it were Andreessen Horowitz, Mark Andreessen, Chris Dixon. A lot of people were associated with, kind of the more crypto world today, who I don't think really had ever got Bitcoin, but they, were diving into it, trying to make money. And they're also trying to clean up the industry, right? There was a sense that these libertarians, these anti-war people, they were here early, but we're getting rid of them. This is the next Facebook, this is going to be the mainstream thing, and we're cleaning that up. And yeah, there was a lot of tension even at that time, right? Big clashes of personalities, big names, and yeah, there really was a war to kind of, I think, define what Bitcoin was and how people understood it. So I really just got sucked into that story because it was just such a exciting thing, right? I always say like Bitcoin got me because of the story. Somebody, wrote this piece of code that was worth money, and now we know it's just such a miraculous thing, right? I like to say to people if they've heard of like the Philosopher's Stone or something like that. Like Satoshi Nakamoto like made gold from nothing. Like he's like a sorcerer and like the classic 18th century, 17th century, Isaac Newton, like one of his big things was he like wanted to create an artificial gold. Like, Satoshi did that. He's like the heir to all these like crazy, witches and wizard type witchcraft inventors. And yeah, in our lifetime, somebody made gold. And, I tweeted today, he's now the 19th richest person in the world. But yeah, that's based on something that he invented. He invented a money that is making him, if he's alive, we don't know, one of the richest people in the world. And that's really just such a fascinating story. Yeah, there you got the tweet right there. It's climbing up the Forbes list
Yeah.
there. So yeah, it really was the story, right? And but I was a journalist, right? So there was a lot of there was a lot of fear back then of, if I get in and if it goes to zero, who's going to hire me again? Because, not only then I'm the journalist guy and I'm the Bitcoin guy. And if I back this Bitcoin thing, like maybe I'll never get a job. So I kind of had this fear that if, I really bought in on Bitcoin and I did the journalism thing, I would go to zero, like I'd lose both bags. I just go. in the worst case scenario, it's like, oh, I'd lose all the Bitcoin and no one would ever hire me again. So I kind of hedged, right? I rode the 2013 market. I like bought, panic sold, bought Litecoin for some reason. I thought it was the next Bitcoin, right? I made all the like beginner mistakes. But CoinDesk seemed like it was going to be a real thing, right? We were able to raise some venture capital money because the US was the nexus there. I was able to kind of grow a team, and by 2014, it felt like okay, maybe this is going somewhere. Like maybe Bitcoin is not the thing. Maybe it'll go somewhere else. But I can at least cover it. I've got a good job. Somebody's paying me money to do something. To do something. And yeah, I dove into it from there, and have been doing it 9 to 5. Well, really, I guess 24/7 since then, in some degrees. So yeah.
And it just keeps going. You keep going down the rabbit hole. What made you start? Because you have a very specific style of posting on Twitter, and I really
Mm.
love it because it goes so deep into people's history. It tells you
Oh,
the people that you don't even think about, people that you have no idea even existed. Like I was actually in I was in Japan,
uh-huh.
and I was scrolling through your feed, and I'm just looking through, and I think you posted something about Mount Gox at the
Okay.
time, and
Yeah.
I was thinking, wow, I'm here. I'm where Mount
Yeah.
Gox was, and it just felt so, I don't know, it felt so interesting to me that just
Yeah.
seeing the fact that this has gone so far,
Mm.
and there's so much to come. What made you start choosing the kind of style of posts that you do? So I'll actually show one on the
Yeah,
screen
sure.
while
So
you
I
explain.
post every day. Just I kind of give a quick fact or kind of an interesting or notable moment that happened in Bitcoin's history. So if you follow my account, you really get a few things. You get kind of kind of I call it like the fortune cookie of the day. You open it up and there's some sort of fact, or you get like kind of long threads about some of these like early Bitcoin innovators and pioneers. So I just did one on
Those are the
Peter.
ones that I love the most. Like these are the ones that I love the most. They're great.
Yeah, these ones are the for the deep cuts. These are for the fan.
Yeah.
So how did I do that? So yeah, I think over time my conviction in Bitcoin increased, right? And it didn't really hit for me until 2017, right? So my perspective was shaped by this period of Bitcoin history called the Fork Wars. So essentially what
Mm.
happened was, the price kind of went down in 2014, all the Silicon Valley people left, and it was just the nerds and the hardcore Bitcoin people. And there was like tremendous disagreement about what Bitcoin was and where it should go and how it should be developed. And pretty much, you saw kind of major figures emerge who were really just evaluating everything about Bitcoin. And a lot of what we know was really shaped in that period. So you would have had the first kind of altcoins kind of start emerging and those kind of grew in factions. But it was a wild time because essentially I say to people that I don't think they realize it's like people thought Bitcoin was dead. Like I would go to conferences and, we knew that we were interested in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but, I remember being at a financial conference like in Wall Street. This was done by it's an organization called the DCCC. So this is the main clearinghouse in the US. This is where all the money goes from all the banks. They're the last stop for the central bank. It goes to the DCCC. So they did a event and Patrick Byrne, the CEO of Overstock, got on stage and he started talking about Bitcoin. And you could feel it in the room that like he was talking about something that like shouldn't have been talked about. It was like he said a bad word. There was like a hush, right? It really did get to the point where it was a handful of people who are still interested in it. And the Fork Wars was really, I think, a period where yeah, when I came to Bitcoin, it seemed complete, right? And then I got sucked into a period where almost every part of it was reevaluated because ultimately what the fork wars were about is that the developers were competing over how to design the software itself, and that manifested into kind of different competing software versions. And then other people just split and left Bitcoin entirely to kind of do new things to solve these problems. So it was really like this great Cambrian explosion of Bitcoin happened. And then, I like to say to people when you go to a museum, you ever go to an old airplane museum and you see all the experimental planes, like this was that period. So like the planes that are bouncing and they're, waving or they've got four wings or something. All right, this is when you saw, yeah, the Wright brothers flew, like that was Satoshi, but this was the period where it was like everybody in a field with like a bicycle that they could attach a couple wings to was like flying these planes. And it was just weird, right? Like I remember being in there was this one conference where people were debating the future of Bitcoin, where I was in a room with like three other people, one of whom was Adam Back, and he gets up on this like this to this whiteboard and he just writes what is Bitcoin on it, and then he just stops. He just didn't say anything for like a couple minutes, and then they just like wrote words on it. And they were like decentralized, and this is like while all these people were like fighting to like figure out what's happening with Bitcoin. And it was like I was like, wow, like we're really just figuring this out. And like, that was the first time it kind of felt like, I don't know, like a science to me. Like it was something bigger than what I had originally thought it was, which was kind of this like dorky internet money kind of thing. And it was really watching Bitcoin. I say this, watching it succeed despite all those people trying to do things with it, like watching Bitcoin triumph over like the wills of all these people. Because back then you had really strong personalities. Also, they have many stories, but again, like because my experience was shaped through their story and their inability to control Bitcoin, that's really what it was, right? Different people wanted to control Bitcoin for different reasons. And then sort of seeing them all fail, I was like, okay, Bitcoin is really decentralized. It's really different. Because all at that time, you had Bitcoin, it had a foundation, it had a lead developer, all the things that you associate with, your Ethereums, your Solanas. It felt like everything else. And then it was really that differentiation point where, you saw people like try to exert influence over it, and Bitcoin withstood that. To me, I was like, okay, like Bitcoin's it. This is the differentiator. And a lot of people, I say that if you have a real fundamental view on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it was really shaped by that time period. And I can
Mhm.
go and look at other people's views, and yeah, I know that they think certain things about that time period because it was like, they say that there's decades where nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen, right? We're maybe seeing
Yeah.
this with the presidential election right now, where it feels like decades are happening. Donald Trump's coming in, it's going to shrink the government. But it was really one of those times for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It was just a time of like immense exploration, immense fear, immense uncertainty. And yeah, I'd like to. I want to build some canon of people so they can go back and look at that, because ultimately I do feel that Bitcoin is going to be this monetary system the whole world operates on. We have to kind of respect it to the level of like democracy or something like that, right? And so with democracy, it's you can go back and you can read the founding fathers. You can read Adam Smith, you can read uh, you know um, John Adams, you can read Thomas Jefferson, and you kind of get a sense that democracy as we have it isn't anything that one of them invented, right? They all contributed to this thing that is democracy, and we can have a good conversation about it today, like something like a Hamilton, like a play, right? You can have a piece of art that's done about the history of America, and it feels like okay, you can explore different things, right? There's not like one way to think about it. And yeah, that's really what I want to do with the history, right? I want to let people kind of come in, like learn about people, and then explore Bitcoin as an idea through those people, because ultimately I feel like people are story and people focused. That's how people think about history, right? If you think about the internet, it's like Steve Jobs, Wozniak, you have your players in your mind, right? So I kind of want to create that for people so that they can come in and kind of build their own kind of theory of what Bitcoin is, like if they want that, right? Obviously, you can just buy and hold, and it's a good store of value. But if you want to kind of really dig into the weeds of how did this come to be, because I really do think that it's 100K. We're pushing on 100K today. We're 16 years in. Flash forward 20 years. This is the whole world's money, and it's worth millions of dollars. Like, what are you going to think about it? I feel like people will want to know. They're like, how did this happen? And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to get as much as I can while the people are still there and preserve that, because I think that will be valuable.
Yeah, it's almost like an archive that anyone can refer to, like to see, oh, why did this happen? Why is
Mm.
this the way that it is? Because I actually did refer to your content when I was looking through. I think you were talking about it in another podcast when I was trying to learn more about the fork wars because I wasn't around then. I had
Yeah.
no idea. There were books on it, of course, but books are going to be a lot of them are going to be biased. So the way that I try to learn is I try to listen to podcasts, I try to see different people's points of views, and I try to put it all together. Can you just do you know how many of those posts you've done? Uh
The kind of legend series posts.
yeah, I really like those ones. So
Yeah, probably like 30 or so. So there's
30.
probably it's divided into kind of like people and then events. And then
Okay.
the events are a little bit more like can also be like just crazy stories. Like because I like, with the you have your serious like part of American history where you're like, oh, founding fathers, like democracy or whatever. I don't know where you're from, but
I'm in Canada.
oh, Canada. Okay. So like, you familiar with like the story of like Babe the Blue Ox or something like that? Or like
I'm not.
okay, like or like Davy Crockett, like does that mean anything to you?
I think so. I think I've heard
Like
that name before.
so in America, like we have like the early Western like explorers. So there's like these
Oh,
weird
right.
side stories, right? Like where Davy Crockett was this guy who like lived in the woods and killed a bunch of and lived off the land, and he was at the Alamo, which is like a famous battle, and he was kind of a badass there. Where like Paul Bunyan was like a famous like mythical people, right? Like where it's the
Yeah.
story is so crazy that it's almost like a part of a weird part of American culture. And I feel like those stories where people like yeah, there are people who like legitimately lost like 300,000 Bitcoin. Like I wrote a story about a guy who like, probably owned 300,000 Bitcoin and then just doesn't have it anymore and was probably still alive. And I think like that's crazy, right? Like people who like lost tons of Bitcoin or had it stolen, or one guy I wrote about, he like he like drew stick figures on the Bitcoin forums, and now he's made over $1 million from doing that, like back in 2010.
Wow.
Like kind of the weird stories of like obscure people and things that are just kind of interesting because you're like, oh, I can't believe that that would have happened, right? There was one guy I wrote about who actually he purchased on Mount Gox while the price was kind of crashing. He bought 250,000 Bitcoin for less than a cent each. And the way
Wow.
that he did that was as the price was crashing down, he bid 1 cent and a hundredth of a cent. So, 0.011. So everybody was putting their buy orders into the penny as Bitcoin was crashing. And so he put it in at like a little bit higher than everybody else. And so he bought up all the coins that were being dumped on the exchange.
Oh, wow.
And then what happened was the exchange rolled it back and they took back the coins from him. So this is a guy who's still alive. His name's
Yeah.
Kevin Day. You can read the thread. Who purchased 250,000 Bitcoin, like owned that. Like at one point, like looked in their account and saw that balance was like 250,000
Yeah.
Bitcoin, and then was just had it taken from him. And so, telling his story, I think it makes you feel better about your own stack and kind of how much Bitcoin you have as well, because it's kind of like, oh, at least I'm not that guy, right? At least I didn't at least I didn't lose like what's 250,000 Bitcoin. I mean, it's probably like
A lot.
$1 trillion. Yeah, it's gotta be
Yeah.
right. So it's like you could be a trillionaire, but
Yeah.
instead, no, an exchange rug you. The rub on that story though is he withdrew like 6,000 Bitcoin or something before they cut him off. So, he's not
Oh,
maybe
he
he's
got
not doing
6,000.
too
Yeah.
if he's not maybe he's not doing too bad if he kept
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. That's really so who do you think are the five most
Oh,
influential people in Bitcoin's history, just based on your research, based on the time that you've put in?
yeah, that's a good. So the top five, I would say, yeah, the biggest one who's fallen off, I think that isn't popularly known anymore would be Greg Maxwell. He's probably a
Oh,
name that you've heard a little bit about, but I would say it was probably one of the most serious intellectual contributors for Bitcoin on the developer side. Peter Todd, I would say, is another
oh,
one.
Peter Todd.
He's
Yeah.
kind of as I learn more about Peter Todd, I think he's climbing up my list into my top five. I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto, you really can't exclude him for for whatever he did. Which was pretty much everything. And let's see, that's three picks. Marsha Popescu, who's like another one that people don't really know,
I've
but
never
kind
even
of
heard of him.
okay. He's sort of the father of like Bitcoin maximalism. So like the
Oh,
way
okay.
where he was kind of the first one to sort of he's a long story but like the old timers, like everyone the way I say about Mersha is everyone is like a fan of Mersha, so like your Pierres, your Saifedeans, like all the people who you kind of think of as like modern Bitcoin
Okay.
maxi
It's
culture.
like it's like your favorite influencer's favorite influencer.
Yeah, I used a quote to write about. He's actually dead now, but I wrote in his
Oh,
obituary for Bitcoin Magazine. There's a famous band in the United States called the Velvet Underground, and what they say about the Velvet Underground is they only sold 10,000 records, but everyone who bought a copy started a band. And
hmm.
that's kind of what Mersha was able to do because he was the first person to kind of see Bitcoin from like a non-Western perspective. Like a lot of the people who came to Bitcoin early were either in the US or in the UK or Western Europe, right? So he is interesting because he was in Romania and he was a Romanian entrepreneur, kind of crazy guy. He like made a bunch of money in architecture, archaeology, and like retired. Also, like really crazy beliefs. Like he owned consensual slaves, so he had women who lived with
Wow.
him who were like his slaves, and he would blog about that. And he had this whole sort of blogosphere that he managed. But essentially, he lived through the fall of communism, and he lived through like the crony capitalism of Romania, right? Because Romania was a sort of kind of in the UN, but like sort of a backwater kind of state. And so he was one of the first persons to see Bitcoin and be like, no, this is like better than anything I have today because this is totally outside the superstructure that like really oppresses, the developed world or the developing world. And a lot of his early writings are about, we don't need to change Bitcoin at all. Like, fuck the developers, like, kick them all out. So he famously kind of made a version of the Bitcoin software that just stopped after Satoshi left. And he was like, I'm not adding anything. And he would sort of go out and make fun of the developers and like he called them the Power Rangers. So he would be like, every time one of the developers would like, post a new update, he would like post a picture of like one of the Power Rangers or something like that. And he was kind of big into this idea that like, no, it's like I get to define what Bitcoin is, because I run my node, I run my own software, I can make my own software. And then if you make something else and I don't run it, like you don't exist. Like he used to call other people serfs. He used to say like I'm the king and like you're the serf. Like you have to convince
I
me.
remember this story from you. Now it's coming to me. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah, so he had this whole mindset where like, within Bitcoin, it's like actually like the idea of Bitcoin sovereignty like really kind of comes from him, right? Where it's like I am sovereign and Bitcoin is sovereign. One of his most famous blog posts is Bitcoin is a sovereign, and he kind of talks about Bitcoin as being like, equal to all the other government currencies. And he kind of lives on even in crypto land because there's a funny thing where the SEC tried to shut down his exchange. And he wrote them this big long letter, which was essentially like, I live in the world of Bitcoin. Like, we don't recognize your state. And like, you have to come
wow.
here and arrest me if you're going to shut me down. And like, it's kind of
Wow.
even in Bitcoin legal circles, it's kind of like, who the hell would do this? Like, who would actually like write this to the SEC? But yeah, he probably owns like 100,000 Bitcoin. It's funny that like you can go back and he would publish. So he ran an exchange. It was like a stock exchange. You could like go public. Eric Voorhees Satoshi Dice actually went public through this. So, he started a business and you would issue shares backed by Bitcoin, kind of like what Master MicroStrategy is doing.
Right.
So he would issue shares in a company backed by Bitcoin, and his exchange did that. And then he did that with his company, and he would publish updates every month, right? So it would be like income 80,000 Bitcoin, expenses, 90,000 Bitcoin or whatever. And it's
Wow.
like
Yeah.
profit, 200,000 Bitcoin or like whatever, right? Because it was just back then it would have been like 2011, 2010. So he's one of my favorites. I got four right there. Let's see, Peter Todd, Greg Maxwell, Mersha. We'll add Satoshi there. Who's my last pick? Um, hmm, you're stumping me right now. Let me go through some of my recent selections. Who have I written down?
Yeah. What about Adam Back, Pierre Rochard?
Yeah, Adam. Controversial. I would not put Adam in my top
No, you
five.
wouldn't. Okay. Why?
Oh, and I love Adam. I speak to Adam
Of
like
course.
personally. Why would I not put Adam on top of? To me, like I think if you're top five, kind of like Bitcoin, like history of like important figures, you have to kind of like add to the thought in like a pretty
Significant
substantive
way.
way, right? Like you come into the kind of narrative of Bitcoin and like Bitcoin kind of changes kind of after that. Or kind of have some unique insight. And I feel like Adam, he's a super valuable, like top 50 for sure, top
Right.
25 probably, but I maybe leave him out of the top five, maybe top 10. But yeah, Adam, his real contributions are before Bitcoin, right? So
Mm.
hash cash and kind of developing proof of work and working with the cypherpunks, that kind of happens before Bitcoin.
Right.
I think that's all really interesting, and it obviously contributes to Bitcoin. But then post Bitcoin, a lot of the things that Adams tried to do, like Blockstream or kind of side chains, like increasing Bitcoin's technical functions, haven't been all that we've wanted them to be.
Yeah.
Obviously, Blockstream's a great company, but yeah, I think for me, I prefer kind of your people like, even like a Peter Todd, because I think Peter, like his contributions to Bitcoin were, and if people who don't know Peter Todd, but you might know him from the HBO documentary that just aired,
Yeah.
where they claim that he's Satoshi, which I actually find really amusing because, like, if you actually know the Bitcoin history, Peter Todd's probably like the least likely candidate. And the reason why is that probably I did a thing with him at PubKey the other day where I did an interview with him, and I said this to him on stage, but probably nobody has done more to undermine Satoshi's roadmap for Bitcoin than Peter Todd.
Oh, wow.
Peter Todd has like pretty much all of the things that Satoshi thought about how Bitcoin would scale or evolve as a currency that we know now are wrong. A lot of that starts with Peter, uh,
Yeah.
if not being the one who thought of it. In many cases, he did, but like being the one who was the champion of that. So early on in Bitcoin, as I mentioned, there was a lead developer. So Satoshi comes along and he leaves, and there's this guy named Gavin Andreessen, who maybe you've heard of, who took over the project and he led it. And he had
Yeah.
the idea that he was the leader, and he kind of managed Bitcoin in the way that he thought Satoshi had, right? Where he just kind of did what he wanted, and if he picked something, this is what happened. He was the leader. He was in charge. It was in the way open source governance way. He was the dictator, benevolent dictator. That's what he would even call himself.
Yeah.
And so Peter Todd was the first one to kind of take a stand against some of Gavin's things and say like, no, like we can't do this because of this technical reason. So he talked a lot about how mining pool centralization was a problem. He talked a lot about how, people needed to run nodes. We didn't want people running wallets where they couldn't validate the blockchain. He talked a lot about the idea that we need to figure out how to get the fee market to kind of replace Bitcoin subsidies so that Bitcoin can be cryptographically secure in the future. So yeah, a huge titan of like the Bitcoin development scene in terms of like kind of how we know and understand Bitcoin today. He put a lot of that infrastructure in. Um, but yeah, and in a time where that was really difficult. The other thing I like about the history is, you're able to go back to time periods where people just thought about Bitcoin completely differently. Like one of my favorite things to do at conferences is, if I meet somebody from like 2013 or 2017 or one of those eras, is just being like, can you believe like this is so different? It's almost like
Yeah.
if you were to teleport me, to this era, it would feel to you like being in a, going from like the, knights to the Roman Empire to like the explorers on ships, right? Just a huge, it's like so different, right? Just like the rate of expansion and change is so wild, right? In 2013, it just felt different, and then I'll give you an example. Like 2017, it was like this time of like extreme tension. Like other than Mercia, like nobody thought everything was fine. Everybody was like running around. There was like people yelling at each other. Like Roger Ver was swearing at people and like kicking them out of conferences. And it was just like, there's all this drama. And then you go to 2021 and it's like everybody's like, Bitcoin's going to 1 million. There's nothing that'll stop us. And I'm like, okay, this is, if you just like walked in, open one door, walk into the other door, you'd be like, what happened? Like what happened in
Yeah.
these
Complete shift.
like completely different, right? And I think that I'm interested to see what happens this cycle, right? Because I think that every time there's kind of a new all-time high and Bitcoin reemerges, the story gets rewritten a bit. There's new people who kind of emerge. So I think we'll see new people who are influential on the
Oh,
stage.
of course.
I think Michael Saylor is positioning himself like really interestingly in everything he's doing with
I was gonna
MicroStrategy.
say, would you say Michael Saylor is number five? Because I mean, he's completely changed the corporate mindset, right? And
Yeah,
everybody started looking
so
at Bitcoin differently after him.
So I would say pretty controversially, I almost before the last month or two, I kind of didn't think about Michael Saylor at all when I thought
No, you
about
didn't. Okay.
philosophy. But I do think the master stuff, like I have over the last couple months started to get really interested in it, because I
Yeah.
feel like the MicroStrategy stuff that he's doing now, ever since it really clicked for me, and like I got that, oh, he wants to back companies, get companies to buy Bitcoin. And it's, the whole goal with that, I think, is to make Bitcoin systematically important, right? That's like his goal, is that, and also to, provide, I think, a new route for capitalism, right? I think he sees a world, and this was clear in his like podcast with Saifedean, where they kind of had a lot of friction. I don't know if you saw that
Yeah. Yeah. I
one.
remember the
Michael Saylor
yield.
calls Saifedean a communist, which
Yeah.
was hilarious. But
Oh,
yeah, so I think like Michael Saylor sees a world where businesses still outperform Bitcoin, right? Like in the capitalist sense, where you have an economy, the role of a business is to outperform the value of money. And I see him now, kind of like now that Master is like really kind of taking off, like stepping into this role where I think he's actually kind of paving a role for what he wants future entrepreneurs to be. And I think he said that to Safe Dean pretty explicitly, where he was saying, there's always going to be entrepreneurs, there's always going to be countries, there's always going to be competition, and Bitcoin has to we have to orient around that. But that doesn't mean that there won't be lending. That doesn't mean there's not banking. That doesn't mean that the systems fundamentally change. It just means Bitcoin is the benchmark. I actually love that. I wrote Saifedean afterwards and I said, this is one of the best podcasts you've done. And I'm glad that you feel comfortable now, kind of having disagreements with people because I think you learn a lot. My theory is that
Yeah.
you always learn a lot in disagreements. Uh, and I had an argument with Saifedean about this because he doesn't agree. But my counter argument is that conflict is like anti-fiat. You know, if you have a conflict with somebody, you're showing who you are. You know, so in that moment, what's great about it is that you don't see Michael Saylor and Saifedean agree. You see that like 95% of the things that they agree on are the same, but they actually disagree on like this little portion, and the little portion is really interesting, right? Saifedean
Yeah.
kind of sees Bitcoin and wants Bitcoin to be this cleanser of the world, right? Safe's from Palestine. He's from a country that is struggling to be exist as a country where property rights have been denied for thousands of years. He wants Bitcoin to equalize and take down these power structures. And
Right.
Michael Saylor is the opposite. He's a CEO from like a publicly traded U.S. company who wants to keep these power structures, intact. And I think that's fascinating because these are the things that I'm still interested in today. That this is what keeps me in the game. Is okay. How's this going to play out? And I think it's a wonderful illustration of just, I love both of them equally. I think Saifedean's a great figure in the Bitcoin history. I think Michael Saylor's a great figure in the Bitcoin history. But history is still to be written, and it's not guaranteed who's going to be right. Just like it was kind of in Bitcoin's past with the figures that I grew up with. Gavin Andresen was once a god, right? You would walk into a conference and everybody would crowd around him, and they would hang on every word, and and then this is how it is, right? There people come into Bitcoin and they push it forward. And then sometimes Bitcoin moves past certain people, right? So sometimes people can only be relevant for so long, and there isn't much for them to contribute anymore, right? So
I think
every
that's the thing, right? Everything gets what's it called? Everything gets uh disrupted. Every single person, every single idea, and but Bitcoin can't be disrupted because Bitcoin is the future. Would you agree with that? Do you think that that's, I mean, I know you were having a discussion where you were saying how we can't just sit around and watch Bitcoin. It's not going to survive if we just do that. I think we need to actually put
uh,
in the effort.
I actually don't know about that. I think
Oh,
that
okay, okay.
it could. It's just
Yeah,
that
you
like
think so? Okay.
so it's like yeah, I think with Bit well, I'm so you're talking about the current disagreement about like Bitcoin software activations and like sort of improving Bitcoin as a technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more of a Jameson than a Jimmy Song. They did a debate in Lugano about ossification, where Jimmy sort of order, and I'm friends with both of them. Jimmy argued against for ossification, saying it was good, and Jameson argued against. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. I think for me, um, as someone who watched the Bitcoin development process, the technical process kind of evolve, it is actually much healthier than it used to be. We know more about that process. I think Lynn Alden just put out a great paper with a few other folks. I think it might have been Moneyball, Steve Lee from Square, kind of talking about how
Hmm.
Bitcoin consensus upgrades happen, and like trying to normalize discussion of the process a bit. So to me, I come from a period where there was a lot of emphasis on development and there was a lot of emphasis on upgrading Bitcoin. And coming it from that Peter Todd perspective of like, Bitcoin isn't perfect and it can still fail. And it's like kind of up to us to manage whatever Bitcoin is, right? Um, so I led my presentation in Lugano, which was a debate with Mechanic and Luke Jr. about this, with by basically saying like there's two real scenarios for Bitcoin in the future. I think when it comes down to it, either so many people are using the Bitcoin chain that the fees are replacing the subsidy, right? Meaning that
Yeah.
there's a healthy fiat. People are paying to use Bitcoin, and miners are getting paid in the fees because in order to keep Bitcoin finite, at some point they won't produce Bitcoin, right? So that's kind of state one. State two is that never happens, and it's still okay, right? Like for whatever reason, maybe there's large governments or large companies, and they're geographically dispersed, and they just run Bitcoin altruistically, even though they like kind of lose some money on it because everybody uses it and it's so great. And there are amongst the kind of Bitcoin thinkers, right? Like these are kind of the two things. There isn't really an in between. It's like either we have fees or we don't.
Yeah.
And the history of Bitcoin has been that like other than the recent kind of ordinals, runes developments, like we really haven't had many fees, right? The fees have kind of been done. And it's even worse now, I think, because with the ETF, even if you might have noticed over the last few days, there's all this buying. there's not an increase in fees in the blockchain. And the answer, why is that? Because everybody's buying the ETF.
Yeah.
So, but you're actually not even buying, all these buys are not actually even hitting the blockchain. So, what's happening is, yeah, maybe 100,000 people, maybe a million people are going to Fidelity and they're smash buying their ETF. But at the end of the day, Fidelity is just bulk buying that Bitcoin, like kind of in one purchase and prorated distributing it. So at on chain, you have one transaction. So
Yeah.
if you're concerned about a future where like fees are important, then like that's kind of bad because like you basically don't have people using the blockchain. So I don't know. I think everything kind of comes from that, right? Like that we're either going to live in one of those two scenarios. And my only point I think is that like I think we can test one of those. Like one of them you can test, right? You can try to drive up fees consistently, and you can try to see how the actual technology works. Because like if you think about it, I don't know, the new people or like people from like the 21, 22 era, maybe like yourself, will like, we built Lightning and the whole point of building Lightning was that we thought there were going to be high fees. And so now that like fees are low, it's sort of like, why would the impulse to use Lightning isn't really there. So it's funny,
Yeah.
even though after like 7 years, we built this thing because we thought it was going to be important. We actually made 3 or 4 updates to Bitcoin to make this thing. And then now that it's live, it's like, okay, like some people don't even I don't even really use Lightning that much, when
Oh,
I'm
okay.
I buy from it. Do you use Lightning? I'm curious. Yeah, I don't know.
I use it here and there. Like I have a guy who's working with me from Nigeria. I send him Bitcoin because if I were
Yeah,
to
I don't
send him,
not use it, right? Like
yeah,
if I'm at a thing and they take Lightning and I've got money in a Lightning wallet, I'll use it. So I'm not like anti-Lightning, but I'm just saying
yeah,
like in the way that like we kind of thought when it was first, because I remember the people who wrote the paper, they were just like a couple kids hanging around the conferences. They were like 24, 25 years old. And they were like, oh, we're gonna build Lightning. Blah, blah, blah. And then like we kind of thought everybody would use Lightning, that it would be so expensive to use the Bitcoin chain that like, you'd have to use Lightning really in some
yeah,
instances. So it's a great example of how just because you think of things one way at one time, it isn't always the case that that's going to be the correct. And I think the altcoin, kind of casino of things, they're like a testament to that. Because a lot of
yeah,
the people who left to try to rebuild a better Bitcoin, they started working on some problem. And then by the time they fixed the problem, it wasn't even a problem anymore.
yeah,
Great example, like Ethereum, like early Ethereum, because I mean, I know Vitalik from that era. I went to a bunch of their conferences. All about Bitcoin mining is going to consolidate. Nobody's going to be able to compete for rewards. We got to do staking, like and it's good for the environment and like yada yada. So we're gonna launch as a proof of work because that's fairly distributed. But then we're gonna switch to proof of stake because like everybody will be able to participate in the rewards or whatever. And then they spend years doing this, like 3 or 4 years working on this. And they got proof of stake live. And then as soon as they got proof of stake live, it was like, oh well, we can mine using waste energy. And like now proof of work is good because we can actually help the
yeah.
environment. We can drive offshore rigs, to stranded pockets of energy and we'll decentralize mining through that, so like the whole way we thought about it just completely changed.
Completely changed. Yeah,
So it wasn't that like their original perception was just wrong, like, it wasn't on the conditions that they were making the evaluation, it seemed plausible, right? But then they went and did the thing and it was just totally useless.
yeah,
So like what's the point in doing it? So there's many such cases, right? To use the meme, it's like many such cases of that where like people in Bitcoin or trying to kind of work around Bitcoin tried to build these things and we just didn't need them.
yeah,
But I think we the point is I think we still don't really know if you want to I think we want to be sure that Bitcoin will last for hundreds of thousands of years, right? I think everybody wants that.
yeah.
And then the thing is because you have two future states, and like in one of those future states, there's like some concern over how Bitcoin would operate. It's a untenable, it's a weird position, you know.
So, so do you think we would still have the same fees if Lightning didn't exist? Do you think that fees would be so low? I don't know what the fees are right now, but I think they were under $1 not too long ago. But do you still think that that would be the case? I don't think so because to move Bitcoin, I mean,
Hmm.
on the base layer you're getting final settlement. On layers on top, you're getting just basically an IOU, and that IOU makes it takes the weight off of the base layer. So I actually think that if Lightning didn't exist, if the ETFs didn't exist, the fees would be much, much, much higher, right? So I
Oh,
think
sure.
Lightning and ETFs are doing what people want it to do because the way that I see it, like let's say for the ETFs are almost like a layer two,
That's kind of
right?
controversial. It's a hot take.
You wouldn't agree with that? I don't know. Tell me what you think. I want to learn from you, right?
Uh,
Maybe I'm wrong.
well, so yeah, I think that conceptually the ETF isn't really much different from an exchange, right? So other people have
Yeah,
also called exchanges L2s, and that's weird because the exchanges are launching L2s, like a lot of them are launching it on Ethereum and stuff like that. Do I think that the ETF is an L2?
not really an L2, but what I mean is it if somebody just wants to hold Bitcoin as a store of value,
Hmm.
I mean, they're not going to get all the benefits as holding Bitcoin on the base layer. I understand that part. But it just makes it so that there isn't as much of that. That's the point of a layer two. No, like the point of a layer two is to take some of the stress off the base layer. And the way that I see it, I mean, the ETFs are doing that. But then again, I see your side.
You're in the theory soup here now. Yeah, it's hard to navigate, right? And there isn't a real right answer. I think that the
Yeah,
it's like this is all the stuff that we're exploring. I really believe that we should bring more people into that. Like, I think
yeah,
it's a problem that I don't know. It's like, yeah, we don't know. That's the thing. It's like we
that's
don't
it.
know. I don't think there's people who have theories about how this could or should work. Yeah, I align a little bit more with the people who are a little bit troubled by the ETF. I do think the ETF in particular, uh, it isn't Bitcoin in the way that Satoshi wanted it. I don't think,
Right.
right? He wanted people to hold their own Bitcoin, and like maybe, the ETF gets people to that, and eventually they learn. But I was in a spaces yesterday with Shinobi, who also writes a Bitcoin magazine, and the concern that the technical people, are again, they're concerned about a lot of things, but as they feel a situation where, you have all these Bitcoin and ETFs, and maybe there's a technical update that Bitcoin needs to do, and then the ETFs they just don't go along with it for some reason. So now you have sort of an adversarial situation
A
where,
fork.
maybe there's a fork, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that Bitcoin has some. Here's what I would say. Bitcoin, another thing that I said on the panel there is there are people who want Bitcoin to be just money. There's this big meme. It really penetrated the culture in like 2021, 2022, that Bitcoin is money, but that is just money. And that's really not true. That actually is untrue because Bitcoin is a piece of software. Like that software has to operate, and that software has to be like game theoretically secure, meaning that the costs of all the participants operating it has to be in an equilibrium, right?
Right.
The reason that you can just trust the code is because you know that miners are going to behave a certain way under the current conditions. But in the future, when, with fees, like you don't know that equilibrium is going to hold, right? So essentially, that's the paradox of it.
Yeah.
So Bitcoin is a technology, right? It is a software, and it is possible for that software needs to be updated. So that is just an actual thing that like if
Yeah.
Bitcoin isn't digital gold, yes, its monetary properties make it compete with gold, but the fundamental like actual makeup of what Bitcoin is, even if you're holding it in an ETF account, like that ETF account is a share of a network that is run by people, that is run by nodes and houses, that is run by miners in Africa and Siberia, and that are distributed around the world. That is game theoretically secure. Like that is the engine of the thing. So that software does have to be maintained, and the nature of software is such that either external conditions change or it might change. Jameson
Yeah.
gave a really nice example at the beginning of his talk where he argued, just kind of against ossification, which was that, if you build a house, you can have a strong foundation. But let's say your house is next to a river, and let's just say over time, flood patterns change, like the weather changes, and all of a sudden that river is next to your house. Just because you didn't do anything different, but
Yeah.
just because the stream got diverted and now your house is flooding because not because of anything you did, but external conditions changed, right? So yeah, I think that Bitcoin is a software. It has to be treated as that. And so ultimately that software has to be maintained through some process. That's kind of the core thing that of I think being very true. Like that seems very true. And
Yeah.
then that software has to be maintained in some process. And that requires humans making decisions and coordinating. And that is like the uncomfortable thing at the bottom of Bitcoin, because I think as our certainty about Bitcoin in the future has increased, and I think this comes to like Michael Saylor, like why is he uncomfortable with developers and development? I think he is uncomfortable with it because he wants the certainty that like Bitcoin is like an absolute thing, because we've kind of memed that into existence. We've like really hung up on this, like, Bitcoin can never change. There's nothing that can ever happen. But like then the nature of it is that it is this piece of code that has to be maintained by humans. And like I'm really hesitant to like get. I don't think you can get rid of that. I just
Hmm.
see a scenario where that goes away as being almost impossible because Bitcoin would effectively cease to exist. So there are I was talking with Casey Rodarmore, the creator of Ordinals, about this, and he said, there are certain things about reality that are just inconsistent. So he cited like particle and wave theory, right? Like reality is just made of particles and waves, and like that's how it is. Like it doesn't matter what you think about it or how you want it to be. Like Bitcoin is money and it's software. It's
Yeah.
two things, and it's both of those things. And maybe you like one of those things more than the other, but you can't really extract them, right? Because at the end of the day, they're fused. Bitcoin is
You can't
never not going
separate
to
them
be a
essentially.
software. Right. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't. Like Bitcoin's never not going to be a software.
Yeah. It's
No
true.
matter
Yeah.
how big it becomes, like what it is, like it is a piece of software.
Yeah.
You can't get around that. And software just has, you update your software on your phone, right? Every couple months, Apple
You have
pushes
to.
something in and updates while you sleep. And yeah, a lot of the like Bitcoin theoretical discussion, I think, is about this. We've talked about Luke Jr. I would say Luke Jr. is in my top 10. Very
Oh,
controversial.
Luke.
I don't
Okay.
know if he
Top
gets
10.
to my top five, but I would, since I didn't give you a fifth one, I'll give you Luke Jr. as someone who's like also on the cusp, who I don't actually agree with about some of the things, and I debated him in Lugano, but I do think he is a very great intellectual contributor, because I think he saw a lot of this as well, where um, you know, he has this great line earlier where it's like, he didn't want Bitcoin to be a monarchical currency, monarchical. So like someone who
Yeah.
was owned by a monarch, right? Uncomfortable phrasing, but yeah, early on, Satoshi ran it as he was a monarch. Satoshi was a king,
Yeah.
and we've had to take, away Satoshi's authority, and we've kind of limited the authority amongst developers, but that crucial paradox, I think, is still there, and I think that the answer to that is probably making more people informed about it and participating in it than like less informed. And maybe to just draw on
Right.
like the US election thing is a good example, where it's like, why did the right and why did Elon and Trump win? Like, did they have the best solutions? Like, they were good at making people involved, I think. They like, we saw Vivek on podcasts and we felt familiar with him, and the whole Republican team that's coming over to take over the US government, it feels like a social media reality show that we're like,
Yeah.
I feel like I kind of picked these people. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
like,
That's a great comparison. Wow.
yeah, I don't agree with everything Vivek says, but I'm like, I get it. I'm comfortable with it because like I've saw him at the Bitcoin conference in like last couple of
Yeah.
years. I saw his podcast, right? Whereas the Democrats, I'm actually like naturally Democrat. I voted for Trump for the first time.
Oh.
I voted Republican for the first time in my life, but I just don't relate to these people. Like, who are they? They just come on TV and they say like a couple things. So I don't know. I think like participatory processes are good. So yeah, I don't know. The whole thing about the development culture is like, I just think there are things we have to manage about Bitcoin. They're just not going to go away. And I think the more people are just ignorant of them, that's really the problem. And I understand why it's uncomfortable to explain a lot of the stuff. It's hard,
Yeah.
right? Maybe it's not interesting. You just want to talk about Bitcoin's at all-time high.
No, no,
Uh,
I think it's really interesting. I think what you're saying is really interesting. I think the people who are watching this all the way till now, they're the
mhm.
ones who are actually learning about Bitcoin and they're putting in the time. The people who are ignoring, like the people who clicked off 20 minutes ago, they probably don't have that. Most of them probably don't have
Right.
that deep of an understanding. They probably don't care that much, right? They're just learning to. They're just trying to find a way to get more fiat. That's essentially it, right? They don't care about the actual technology.
And
They
I
don't
think
care
that's
about.
how it starts, right? I always
Yeah,
say that, why did I buy Bitcoin? As I was tired of being financially penalized for not buying.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
so yeah, I think that Bitcoin, yeah, its trajectory is, this is just the beginning. But I
yeah.
think, it's not, it hasn't been an easy road. I think there are probably more things that'll come up. We'll see with the ETFs and the president of the United States getting involved. And the big thing now is that we're going to see the US government start buying Bitcoin.
Yeah, building a
I think,
strategic reserve.
yeah, so I was talking with Aaron Van Werdum. Maybe this is a good way to end it, is because he's also like a historian of kind of the earlier Bitcoin times. And, we were sort of saying it feels like we kind of left the Bitcoin technical era was like 2009 to 2017. That's kind of like my favorite era. That's kind of when we figured out how Bitcoin worked as a software, as a technology, like the game theory. That's kind of all that era. And then it kind of feels like this 2019 to like current era is sort of like Bitcoin emerging kind of fully formed now, like on the world stage, like
Yeah,
impacting El Salvador, like nations, now the US. This is I feel like he feels it a little bit more than I, but he thinks like this is the time where it's gonna, if Bitcoin actually succeeds, he actually feels like the stakes are higher. I actually feel like we were kind of moving. I feel like all the stakes were kind of early on. Bitcoin probably could have been killed, but now I feel like everybody's going to get on board. But he sort of is more like, okay, no, I actually think this is a little dangerous because you have different, nations getting involved. And yeah, I mean, like, who knows, right? Like, there's so many things that we haven't seen. So some things that I'm thinking about, like, okay, let's just say Trump does get in and say, he improves the US dollar, and like, okay, well, maybe the US dollar starts competing against Bitcoin, right? Like maybe they want to go and like supercharge stable coins, right? They've talked a lot about that. I have a lot of concerns about the US dollar stable coin infrastructure that like is being propped up. I think the US has a lot of incentives to grow that. I think you're going to see stable coins being something that is pushed pretty aggressively by the new administration, probably into the future. I think, these systems are going to continue to evolve and compete. I think you're going to get down to like a Bitcoin versus US dollar kind of Amazon Walmart kind of thing, right? Where it's,
yeah,
there's just kind of two big dogs. But the US is manages one of those. We own the Walmart,
yeah.
so we have
That's it.
got to manage the transition somehow. But yeah, we'll see, right? Ultimately, I think we want it's just that what's the life like for the average person, right? So when you think about any of these transitions from like TV to the personal computer to social media, regular media to social media, and it takes a long time. I mean, social
Yeah,
media, that last election was, it's like the social media election. It's 2024, right? So I think, Bitcoin is probably going to be even more a political force in Washington. And it sounds like we're going to get some sort of crypto position in DC. And then the crypto people are going to fight with the Bitcoin people over the laws. So there's always
absolutely.
great drama
Yeah,
ahead. Right? Bitcoin always, again, going back to like great story. It's like, man, what a great story. I would like for it to be good for people and for people. I think in the future to feel like Bitcoin was good, right? That it was a
yeah.
good thing, that people thought about it, and we did enough to like for them to live a little bit of a better life. That would be like a nice
That's it.
thing,
Yeah.
kind of like democracy. Well, everybody talks about democracy now. We're always like, ah, fuck democracy, it sucks. But people fought for that, right? Like
Yeah,
they like actually died like to create that system.
yeah.
And it is better than the other systems. Maybe you don't think that, but like I don't know. Maybe Saifedean's a big, he's a big monarchy guy.
Mm,
But we created that system, and I think Bitcoin will be kind of like one of those things, right? Like, will it always be perfect? Maybe not, but I think if we do it right, we can make it last. And then, but I think people have to be able to come into it. They have to be able
yeah,
to kind of make it their own and see it for different ways. And yeah, that's the part of the history where I felt like I got a chance to see that, like at an early stage. I got a chance to see these people kind of in action, kind of doing things, and I didn't even always understand what
right.
was happening, right? I go back to old interactions I had with some of these like early developers, like a Peter Todd, and I don't even know how much I understood about what they were talking about
Yeah,
at these different times. But I've tried. I think that's I've
that's
tried
it.
to kind of come
That's
up.
all you can do, right? You can just try to figure out where it's going. Sorry, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you
Yeah.
have about 5 minutes left. I
Yeah.
want to ask you one last question. What are your final tips for my audience here? Just
Hmm. Well, don't buy the ETFs. Buy Bitcoin,
okay.
put it in cold
I like
storage.
it. Yeah,
I'm personally use Casa, which I think is great. It's a fantastic service. Really easy to handhold to get you uploaded to a self-custody wallet. I kept on my money on exchanges for far too long. It's really nice, but it's also nice to be like, I don't know. I feel like I'm a non-technical person, right? That's like people
yeah,
ask me why I didn't get into Bitcoin early. It's because I didn't know command line. I didn't know how to do that stuff. So, I'm a non-technical person. But I try to set aside a time like once a month to kind of like learn something new, whether it's like, okay, I set up my first wallet, then I set up a multi-sig, then I, distributed my keys geographically. Then I, played around with like my phrase storage. I try to work on it, right? Maybe I'll
Right.
test a new wallet every now and then. I'll put my wallets in a Faraday bag because it's supposed to be safer, right? Like I could get used to kind of I think ultimately like a lot of Bitcoin thinkers say this better than me, but like the responsibility for you to hold your own money is like one of the coolest things about Bitcoin.
That's it.
If you don't want to take custody of all of it, like take custody of a little bit, just show yourself. Like show yourself the technology and allow yourself to learn. Because it does take time, but it's a process that becomes, if you learn it, it becomes a little bit easier, right? And so give
Yeah.
yourself the gift of forcing yourself to kind of I just don't think there's a way around that, right? I think we want people to use Bitcoin and understand it, and the best way to do it is just yeah, get your hands dirty. Listen to podcasts like
Yeah.
this, but
Exactly.
afterwards, tune the bicycle on the weekends. Make sure it's got the
Yeah.
tires in there and all that stuff.
That's it. Hey, I really appreciate your time, Pete. I don't want to ask you, just plug yourself. Where can people find you? They know the Twitter. What else?
Yeah, Twitter, Pete_Rizzo_ the Bitcoin historian, PeteRizzo.com's got kind of links to some of my podcasts and
Amazing.
conference speaking stuff. I'm going to be at Bitcoin MENA. So if you're in the Middle East, we're doing a conference in December. It was for Bitcoin Magazine. I think that's going to be something. I think a lot of the rumors about like the nation state stuff is probably going to go down there. And I'm just hearing a lot of hype things. I don't say that a lot
Wow.
about our conferences, but I'm hearing hype things. I'm going to
It's gonna
MENA.
be fun. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see some we'll see the sheiks come. The
Yeah.
real Sheik Robertos will be there.
Yeah.
And
It's
hopefully
coming.
buying Bitcoin. Yeah, it's here. It's
Yeah.
out
It's
soon
coming.
for sure.
It's coming. Nobody can stop it, right? That's the thing. It's gonna be here, whether you have Bitcoin or not, whether you're studying Bitcoin or not, whether you're ignoring Bitcoin, it's gonna be here. Just get off zero.
Yeah, for sure. Rajat,
That's it.
thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Appreciate your time, man.